All right, before we get started, Kurt sent me a text earlier this week, and he wanted me to mention a clarification he wanted to make. As he thought about his class he did a few weeks ago on the distinction between the church and the individual and the actions that come from either one. He didn't think that he was clear enough about when the funds were sent to Judea in Acts 11, that they weren't sent to the Jerusalem elders, but to the elders of each congregation in Judea, and then those were distributed among the members. So he wanted me to make that clarification really quick, and I appreciate him and his lesson he taught, and certainly thankful for the work that he did in that. Romans 15 is where we're going to be. We are on the point about how we first talked about one church helping many. And so you have that in Acts 11, that churches in Judea were in need because of a prophesied famine. And then you have Antioch sending money to the care of the elders of each congregation to distribute them. It was not the Jerusalem church simply in context. And that's how we kind of have a look at it. It wasn't Antioch sending to Jerusalem, sending to all these churches. That's not scriptural. We don't see it there. But Antioch sending to each of those congregations respectively, directly by the hands of Paul and Barnabas, the messengers. We're going to see a little bit more of that in the second section, which is about multiple congregations acting together, cooperating, as we're talking about the cooperation of congregations. But how did they cooperate? There was, remember, joint cooperation, and the definition provided, or concurrent cooperation. The difference is combined effort toward a common goal, or distinct efforts, separate efforts toward a common goal. And so it's a difference in regard to money, like we have with benevolence and then supporting preachers and evangelism. It's the difference between 84th Street and another congregation putting their money together and then sending it, and 84th Street sending it to that church in need, and the other congregation sending it to that church in need. In both senses, there is cooperation, but only in one sense is there scriptural cooperation, and that's when we don't combine our efforts jointly, but that separately we're doing the same thing, but within the autonomy of each respective congregation. So this is about multiple congregations contributing to the same work, that is benevolence to the needy saints in Jerusalem. So they're cooperating, but they're maintaining two things: independence from one another, and therefore equality. And we're going to see some of that throughout this. Specifically from Romans 15, 1 Corinthians 16, and 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, they're all talking about the same event, which we've established is not the event that is recorded in Acts 11. It is a separate occasion in the future from the point of Acts 11. But it is when the Jerusalem church specifically, no mention is made of the broader Judea, but just the Jerusalem church specifically, is in great need. And so benevolent funds are sent from Galatia, Macedonia, and Achaia. And we followed through point 1 briefly at the end of the last lesson, where this is needy saints in Jerusalem. We don't know why the need arose, but it arose. Not anything specifically, at least. There are some things that we could think about that might have been the case. But these are not only just needy saints, but they're needy saints where? In this specific case. Jerusalem. And that's important to, again, distinguish between this case and that of Acts 11, because if we combine the two, then we have the ability, by what the reasoning is among those who believe in institutionalism, who are mistaken about this, that the funds were sent from Antioch and all these other congregations to Jerusalem, who then distributed those funds among other churches. And that's what the sponsoring church looks like. One church collects all these funds to do a single work themselves, and that displaces authority and oversight, and autonomy is destroyed, and there's no more independence either, because one church is doing something the other churches aren't doing. and that's not independent, nor is it equal. And so these were needy saints in Jerusalem in this case. And he mentions the point that's pretty important to note, and we emphasized it, but it was the Jerusalem's work. It was their requirement and responsibility by the Lord to take care of their needy members. But God has determined in His infinite wisdom to set up a pattern where, in regard to benevolence, because you think about it, it doesn't matter how poor we are here and how little people we have here, we can always edify each other. We can always evangelize the lost. But if we are a small congregation and we are poor, and there is someone who goes through some pretty bad stuff, their brethren can't help them because they're poor. But other congregations, by God's pattern, can send in money, and the elders can determine who needs what and how much they need and all that kind of stuff, and they can oversee that work. But then it's still the work of that congregation, isn't it? With aid, but who's doing the distribution? That congregation, those elders. It's their work. And so that's where it's important. This is only on a strictly need-for-need basis. It's not just we're feeling pretty generous. We're going to send some money randomly to this congregation who doesn't need it, just so we can do something good. That's not what this is for. It's not just willy-nilly, let's throw money around. It's for very specific instances of need that cannot be met by that local congregation. And of course, we stress that's benevolence as well. And in the conclusion, we'll understand a little bit more about that. So comments, questions up to this point? Yes, sir.
You mentioned a little bit about this on Wednesday, and it reminded me of some lessons previous to this. And the whole idea, in my mind, as a reminder, is that the church was not created to be a business.
Yeah.
It's not a business. And I think you've given some great examples here that show we're not about the ROI.
Right.
The only ROI that we're about is those coming to Christ and following Him and being committed to Him and living a life of righteousness. That's the ROI for Christ. And it's not our ROI. It's a return on investment for Christ. But we're not a business.
Right. That's a great point. And that's why institutionalism is not simply the inclusion of human institutions that God has not ordained, but it's the defining of the body of Christ as an institution, because then it does become business-like. Where I've referred to the church as a divine institution, but even then it's not extremely accurate, because we're a body of believers. And if you think about it as the body, as the called out, the ecclesia, the church, a kingdom where Christ is, the king, then that's very different than a business. Kings are supposed to take care of their people and save them if they need saving, all that kind of stuff. And so it's very different than just a business that's trying to make a buck.
And that would change our focus, right?
Yeah.
If we have a business mindset, that's going to change our focus on I think what you're getting to, the spiritual mindset.
Yes, absolutely. And even, especially if we studied in depth 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, benevolence has a very spiritual tone to it. It's not just monetary, physical stuff. It involves, and that's kind of what we'll see even here in Romans chapter 15, because there's fellowship that's involved, and that's a spiritual thing as well. So I think that maybe just to simplify what we're going through, the following points, some of them may seem random. All he's trying to do, I think, is to show that this is cooperation in the concurrent method, not the joint method. So all these points are showing that all these churches are working together, but they're working as their own group, not jointly. That's all he's trying to do, I think, in these sections. So notice in Romans 15, if someone doesn't mind, read verses 25 through 27.
But now I am going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints. For it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints who are in Jerusalem. It pleased them indeed, and they are their debtors. For if Gentiles have been partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister to them in material things.
Okay, thank you. So, his language and the very spiritual focus here, as Aaron was mentioning, it shows cooperation, even among the churches, giving Macedonia and Achaia, for the poor saints in Jerusalem. Cooperation, but in a very spiritual way where there is still independence. And I think that the key is in the idea of cooperation and fellowship, which is what fellowship shows, cooperation. But here we have, maybe the key word here is reciprocate. And when you reciprocate something, there is a tone of what is coordinate to what you received. In other words, you know, if you feed me, let's say you take me out to dinner and you take me to Mahogany, you know, some expensive steakhouse, and I'm like, I'm gonna pay you back. I'll reciprocate. And I pick you up and I take you to McDonald's. That's not really reciprocation, is it? Reciprocation, there's kind of an equality to it, and some of that may be, you know, based on subjective judgment in regard to things. But in this case, there's got to be in reciprocation this corresponding act that is given because you first received. And that's what we have in regard to the idea of fellowship. So who received something first? Who's reciprocating? Who's paying back? The Gentile churches or the Jews? Gentiles. What did the Gentiles receive from the Jews? Spiritual things. They were taught the gospel to the Jew first, also to the Greek. You think about the apostles for Jews being sent forth. You think about how on the persecution in Acts 8, the dispersion, where they went about preaching the word, and that's how it eventually reached Antioch. That's how that context picks up. Those who were scattered also were preaching to mainly Jews, but some of them preached to some Gentiles. And so they're indebted to them. They received the gospel from them. And so notice in verse 27, there's the original fellowship. They are their debtors. For if the Gentiles have been partakers of their spiritual things, it is their duty also to minister to them in material things. Reciprocate. In what way? He says physically. Now they're in need. So there was an inequality when the Jews had the gospel and the Gentiles didn't. So the Jews gave the gospel to the Gentiles. Now they're on equal ground. But now you have the Jews who don't have money, necessities. They're in want. They're in poverty. But these Gentile churches who are churches and they're thriving spiritually because of the seed planted by the Jews, there's an inequality there. They have money. And that's what he goes on to say in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. It makes the playing field equal, if you will. Now, we don't want, and you don't want, because you've supplied our need. So there's the initial relationship. And the partnership is giving and receiving. That's important. The Jews gave to all of these Gentiles and therefore made churches. And the Gentiles received. Reciprocation means that each place that there are saints who had received spiritual things from the Jews, specifically in Jerusalem, that each place would then participate in giving and then the Jews receiving. Now, if Achaia sends to Macedonia and Macedonia sends to Jerusalem, did Achaia give to Jerusalem or did they give to Macedonia? Now, you might say, well, they gave to Jerusalem, but through the middleman of Achaia or Macedonia. But when it comes down to it, the Jerusalem saints received benevolent funds, but they received them only from Macedonia. They didn't receive them from Achaia because Achaia sent it to Macedonia first and Macedonia gave it. So the fellowship is broken. And that's what we see. The reciprocation is equal in that regard. There's a participation certainly concurrently between Macedonia and Achaia, and both of them respectively giving to Jerusalem. But when it comes down to the fellowship with Jerusalem, that is in a relationship of giving and receiving. And so Achaia gives to Jerusalem, Jerusalem receives. Macedonia gives to Jerusalem, Jerusalem receives. Galatia gives to Jerusalem, Jerusalem receives. But if anywhere that chain is broken, then the fellowship that he's speaking about here is broken as well. Does that make sense? I know that was a bunch of maybe word salad, but... So, here's Church A, Church B, Church C. Church A and B give to C. Church C received from both A and B. But if Church A gives to Church B, and then Church B gives to Church C. Church C didn't receive anything from Church A directly. That's the point. There's got to be that equal relationship and reciprocation. So if the reciprocation, in other words, is giving and receiving, then, and that's with Jerusalem, then Achaia and Macedonia have to give themselves directly to Jerusalem, or else they don't have that relationship with Jerusalem. So there's something similar, and we'll talk about it in more detail in a minute, but in Philippians 4, this is talking about evangelism, the support of the Apostle Paul in preaching the gospel. Philippians 4 and verse 15. He says, "You Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only." The only church that gave them and they received from, or he received from, was Philippi. Now, as we've noticed before in previous studies, the institutional brethren will say that's because Philippians, they were a sponsoring church. But that means that all the churches that sent to Philippi, they weren't giving and receiving. That relationship wasn't involved with the Apostle Paul. They were left out of that fellowship. But that's not what the gospel presents. Before we go any further, just here you go. I drew you a picture. I didn't actually, but he did, and we're going to get to it. So this just, we'll get to it, but it further demonstrates what I was saying. So if Jerusalem, or if Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, and Galatia sent to Antioch, then who does Jerusalem receive from? From Antioch, not all those other churches. But in God's plan, all of them had equal participation in fellowship with Jerusalem. Jerusalem didn't just receive from Antioch. Jerusalem received from Philippi, Galatia, Corinth, and Thessalonica directly. And that's a huge difference, especially as it pertains to the relationship that sustains between us and that other congregation. If there's a middleman, then that relationship is certainly not sustained. So I'll turn over to 1 Corinthians 16. Again, he's I think, emphasizing in this the fact that while these congregations were cooperating in sending benevolent funds to that church in Jerusalem, they were doing it concurrently. They maintained their identity separate from each other. And that's important. There was never this combination of churches or combination of their funds that made up a separate organization, entity, or institution from the local church. That never happened. So in 1 Corinthians 16, in verse 1, he says, "Concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you also must do." He gave those orders to Galatia before he ever gave them to Corinth, but he gave them to Galatia. Was Galatia able to start obeying that? They were, weren't they? Because he gave them to Galatia. He didn't give the orders to Galatia that were responsible for them to fulfill to Corinth. He gave the same orders to Corinth, but they're their own responsibility. If someone came up, if the elders came up to me and told me to go do something, and then right after that they went to someone else and told them to do that thing, maybe the same thing we're being told to do by the same authority, but I better get to it before that other person's ever told, because they already told me. And that's kind of the point. We may be doing the same thing based on the same instruction, but it's my responsibility to do what they told me to do, and it's their responsibility to do what they told them to do. And so I already gave orders to Galatia. They're going to do it whether you do it or not. And that's kind of where we get into 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. But you need to do it too. So they maintain their identity. Corinth can't do it for Galatia, and Galatia can't do it for Corinth. And so when the respective congregations fulfill their responsibility, it's that congregation having fellowship with Jerusalem, even if another congregation does or doesn't. And then verse 2 kind of shows the independence of that. Does Galatia make a collection for Corinth, or does Paul tell Corinth to make their own collection? Paul tells Corinth to make their own collection. On the first day of the week, let each one of you, who's the you he's addressing? Where are they? Corinth. They're not in Galatia. They're in Corinth. Lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper. We've made the point before that storing up, if I'm amassing something the result is a mass of something. If I'm storing up something, the result is a store of something. I'm putting away my goods, and as I'm putting them away, I have an accumulation of goods. But whose is that treasury? It's Corinth's. It's not Galatia's. And so there's a distinction there. And then in verse 3, he says, "When I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem." So you got to send messengers. And who gets to choose which messengers Corinth sends? Corinth does. Now, if they choose a certain messenger to take their gift to Jerusalem, but then the Galatians choose a different messenger to send their gift to Jerusalem, when both of those messengers arrive in Jerusalem, is there a lump sum of cash, or does each messenger have different sums of money? Corinth messenger has Corinthians' money. Galatia's messenger has Galatians' money. So even that language and the messenger being involved shows that this is not joint cooperation, it's concurrent. They may be doing the same thing at the same time for the same congregation, but Corinthians' work is the Corinthians' work. Galatians' work is the Galatians' work. Does that make sense? Yes, sir. Scott.
It just shows God's wisdom and simplicity.
Yeah.
You know, for one, if it goes all to one place, there might be some greedy hands get a hold of that.
Yes.
Plus, it shows the expediting. One church might get it there in a day and a half or whatever, and another one it may take longer
Sure. Yeah.
to accumulate and get there. So, I mean, it's just the simplicity, the honesty, and the expediting it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, you can have your wisdom in business and think you know what would work best, but God already knows. And if we just accept that, then like the point Scott's making, we little by little we'll be able to see, hey, that really makes sense. It does work that way. That's probably better than any way I could have thought of. So there's purpose to this, which is, part of why institutionalism has become a problem, is because instead of accepting that, well, God's probably thought through this a little more than you have, and He's done it perfectly, we start thinking, well, we could do it better. And it doesn't work that way. 2 Corinthians 8 mentions the Macedonians, and Paul is trying to get the Corinthians to be zealous and get their gift ready because he's coming to get it, and he gives the Macedonians as a great example to kind of give them a kick and get them started and think about it. Do you remember what was so exceptional about the Macedonians' involvement in sending benevolence to Jerusalem? 2 Corinthians 8. They didn't have any money. They were poor. But did they give? Yeah, they gave. Now, you would imagine that if you got a congregation like that, and the Apostle Paul knows those brethren in Macedonia, they probably really want to, but it's going to hurt them if they give. They don't have much as it stands, that he would not say, you've got to give. You've got to give. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes congregations, they can't contribute to a great need because they themselves are in need. And so it's interesting that part of the exceptional quality of their involvement in this is that in verse 4, they were imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. In other words, they begged Paul that they could participate in this. Now, if the Macedonians give, and this is the nature of their giving, they were poor and they gave anyway. They didn't just give some, they gave beyond their ability. In fact, they begged us that they could give, even though they barely have anything. There's a reason why Paul's mentioning that. That's unique. That's exceptional. Now, what if their money, as little or as much as there is, that still has its quality of an exceptional nature based on where it came from, the heart that gave it, like the widow and her 2 mites? What if that money is just lumped in with all the other churches' money? It loses its identity, doesn't it? Now Macedonians aren't giving to Jerusalem out of their poverty in that direct way that has this much meaning, but it's just a small part of a greater lump sum. It loses its identity. Makes sense to me. I think that if the institutional method of combining funds in one congregation and that one congregation sending it and effectively getting all the glory, while that's not why we're doing it, then the Macedonians lose all the credit that is due them in this particular text. What difference does it make if it's all going to be a lump sum anyway? But they maintain their identity, don't they? And notice in chapter 9 and verse 4, it says, I'm wanting you to get your gift ready, Corinthians, lest, chapter 9 and verse 4, if some Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting. But the Macedonians wouldn't be ashamed because since Corinth isn't giving or they're not ready, my gift goes to waste. Because like Scott was saying, there's wisdom in that. It's expedited. If one church doesn't follow through, the other churches still can follow through. So Macedonians aren't going to be ashamed because of their failure, but because of the Corinthians' failure. So while the Corinthians need to get their act together, it's not going to affect the Macedonians or any other congregation in regard to their involvement. It just might disappoint them. And so there's individuality in this in regard to the congregations. They're working together, but in a concurrent way. They're still maintaining their individual identity. Anything on that? All right. Also in chapter 8, verses 6 through 10, Paul sends Titus to stir them up to make this contribution. Notice verse 8, and it goes to the same point we just made, but noticing the individuality. I speak not by commandment, but I am testing the sincerity of your love by the diligence of others. So, Corinthians, you, back when I commanded you in 1 Corinthians 16, were really eager about this. You're ready to go. And you're zealous. And I told everyone about that. And the Macedonians, actually, hearing of your zeal, they really wanted to participate too. And so I'm trying to make sure that you're going to follow through with what you initially wanted to do, what you were so eager about doing, the great manifestation of your love. You follow through with it. And the way I'm going to help you follow through with it is by showing just how zealous the Macedonians are. It's their work, separate from the Corinthians' work. Individual churches, local churches, respective of one another. They're not combined. One church, their work motivates this church to do their own work. Doesn't that make sense? But if they're all just kind of under some board of directors, and whether we give to this or not at this moment, we're still under that title, so it's as if we're giving to it. It's not that way. Individual works, but they're motivating them to do their own work. Then notice on number 6, he goes on to point out in this particular context the fact that, and like Scott mentioned before, part of God's wisdom in this is that there's no greediness and no one stealing things. So notice in verse 20, each church chooses their own messengers to take their gift. It's the people they trust. It's the people they know have proven character. They're taking my gift, not that guy, not you. They're taking my gift. And so I'm responsible for getting my gift there. So I got to choose someone that's trustworthy. And they're going to be trustworthy enough to take the whole gift, and the amount we gave initially is going to be there when they get there. That's important. There's wisdom in that. Notice in verse 20, avoiding this, that anyone should blame us in this lavish gift which is administered by us, providing honorable things not only in the sight of the Lord but in the sight of men. In other words, the way that God's telling you to do it is so that no one has any question whatsoever about the integrity in this activity. And everyone knows that what was given and it got there. And no one took a little bit off the top or was dishonest and that kind of stuff. But in this context, you still have this stress on the independence of the congregations. And that's manifested with the messengers. Notice in verse 23, he says this, if anyone inquires about Titus, he's my partner and fellow worker concerning you. And he had mentioned a couple of brethren before. And if our brethren are inquired about, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. The churches chose them. Some churches may have chosen the same messenger, but 84th Street didn't have to choose the same messenger as Mustang, but if they did, it's because they wanted to. That's the point. Autonomy, independence. They may be using the same messenger, but it's based on their individual work and activity. But what's interesting to me there in verse 23, does anyone have a footnote by that word messengers? Do we know what that Greek word is? Apostolos, an apostle. What does an apostle mean? The apostles are what, technically? Who sent them forth? Christ. They're ones sent forth. And so there is a sender and the one sent. And so the messengers are the ones sent forth by each individual church. And the very language is not joint cooperation, but concurrent cooperation. And then he manifests more even in chapter 9 about their gift versus the gifts from the Macedonians and the other churches. Comments, questions on that? I know this can be technical, but it's important. It really gets to the heart of a lot of this and the issues that are there. So another way that the independence, and this is just building on what we've already elaborated on, the independence is maintained by the method that the funds were accumulated. The only way Corinth had any money to send to Jerusalem, the only way the churches of Galatia had any money to send to Jerusalem, the only way that the churches in Macedonia had any money to send to Jerusalem is that every week, on the first day of the week, as each individual member in that congregation had prospered, they laid by in store so that when a need occurred like this, there didn't need to be any more collections. It's already collected. But that's each individual congregation. Corinthians had their own contribution and treasury. The Macedonians had their own contribution and treasury. And I should actually be more specific than that. The individual churches in Macedonia had their own contributions and treasury. And the same thing with the churches of Galatia as well. Yes, sir.
And there's no other guidance on how to collect funds any other way.
Exactly. No other guidance. And so you can't say, well, we want to give more, so we're going to have a carnival, and we'll take the proceeds from that and give. If they had a carnival in Acts, then we could too. But there's no other place in all the New Testament that demonstrates the church raising funds in a way other than this. That's a very important point.
And of course, just keeping the church and the individual separate, the individual could have raised money on their own through
Sure.
a carnival or
Yes.
whatever, or and then if they chose to give all of it or part of it
Right.
toward those that were in need, that's individually we can do things different than as the church.
Yeah, and you kind of remember Acts 4 and Acts 5 with Ananias and Sapphira, that, hey, it was your money. You could have given it. You could have given all of it, some of it, whatever. The reason that you're not right with God is because you lied. But it was in your power to give whatever you wanted. So that's kind of where Kurt's lesson comes in, is there's a difference between the church and the individual. So there's not necessarily something the church can do that the individual can do. Sometimes that's the case. They do the same things, but there's a division there. And so not everything an individual can do, the church can do. So each church acted independently and chose its own messengers, and we've demonstrated that a bit. They could have approved the same messenger, but that was their right and their responsibility to choose that messenger. Now, there's an interpretation of this that is off, where you have all of these churches, and I guess because some of them have the same messengers, all of these churches got together and decided which messenger they were going to use. You don't see that in the context, do you? Now, if all these churches got together or sent their delegates and they decided, who are we going to have bear all of our gift to Jerusalem? Then you got these groups of messengers or a certain messenger, that forms a particular entity that is separate from the church itself. And that is not acceptable either. He mentions that this would then give some authority for, on page number 52, under 8.3, if these men had been chosen by churches convened to take collective action, they would have constituted a separate organic body and would have performed a function the local church could not perform, thus would be justifying a convention, association, or a conference over the churches and for them distributing benevolence. So it's each church's choice. But if now we have a convention of several churches, and one church is like, I don't think I want to use that guy. Well, if they're part of this convention, they're going to use that guy. You see that in denominational drama as well. You've got the Southern Baptist Convention every year. And they go to that. They might determine some differences in doctrine that they're changing or practices that they're changing. But there may be certain congregations that are there that don't really agree with it. And a lot of times what happens is they secede. They get out of that. And now they're their own independent Baptist church or whatever. If there's convention and a combination of churches together making a collective decision for each church, like choosing a messenger, they comprise an institution separate from the Lord's body, and problems come out of that. That's not authorized. That's institutionalism, as we call it. The messengers were chosen by individual congregation. They selected their own messengers to send their gift to Jerusalem. And no church sent money through another church. And we've hit on that several times throughout this. Any comments or questions on that? So there's a chart. So everything we just said is really seen right there. It's not all of these churches sending to one church, Antioch, who sends to Jerusalem. It's all of these churches sending directly to Jerusalem themselves by hands of the messengers they have chosen. Now, the next part is something we've actually already covered in previous lessons, so give me a break. We didn't get to enough of it, but we have covered it to a degree. Churches did cooperate in supporting preachers, but here's what didn't happen. They did not send money to Philippi. All these different churches didn't send money to Philippi, who then sent money to Paul. All the churches that supported Paul sent money directly to Paul. And so that's important, and the distinction is made in Philippians chapter 4. He says in verse number 15 of Philippians 4, "Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only." Now in 2 Corinthians 11 it says churches gave money to Paul, and Macedonia, the Philippians, were a part of that. But here he's talking about the beginning of the gospel. So what the institutional brethren will do is say, see, they're the only ones that ever gave money to Paul. But then in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul says other churches beyond them gave money to me. So that means what they did was they sent it to Philippi, and Philippi sent it to Paul. But he's stressing at the beginning of the gospel, and that's in Acts 16, when the Macedonian call was given Paul in a vision. He went to Philippi, he went to Thessalonica, he went to Berea, and then when he departed from Macedonia, Philippi is the only church that supported him monetarily. And then in Acts 18 is when Corinth was established. And we've noticed that already, that Corinthians was written well after that Philippian church was established. So they sent money directly to Paul, and other churches sent money directly to Paul. So notice in verse 10 of Philippians 4, this is made distinct from at the beginning of the gospel, because he says, "I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last your care for me has flourished again." Again. Why is it again? Because you gave to me at the beginning of the gospel, and now after some time has passed, you're giving to me again. But in what way? It's direct. From Philippi to Paul, he says that I have received, verse 18, from Epaphroditus the things sent from you. Not from Corinth, not from Antioch, not from any other church, from you, Philippi. And so directly from Philippi to Paul. Comments, questions on that? So there it is again. Philippi, they sent money, and the left is evangelism, the right is benevolence, like we just finished talking about. But Rome, Corinth, and Thessalonica, it's representing where Paul is at the time. So Philippi sent to Paul when he was in Thessalonica. We see that in chapter 4 of Philippians, verse 16. "Even in Thessalonica you sent aid once and again for my necessities." Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians 11, says, "I robbed other churches," and he mentions that I received my need when the Macedonians came to me. Philippians are a part of the Macedonians. So they sent money to Paul while he was in Corinth. But where's Paul writing Philippians from? Remember? It's part of the prison epistles. Where is he in prison? Rome. So when Paul's in Rome, he's saying, I just now received what you sent me. And I'm thankful to God for you. But those are 3 separate occasions. And in each occasion, Philippi sent directly to him where he was located. Used a messenger, but sent directly to him. And then Philippi, of course, part of the churches of Macedonia, 2 Corinthians 8, they sent directly to Jerusalem. They didn't send another church that sent to Jerusalem. They sent directly to Jerusalem. And so in the conclusion, he mentions a couple of different things as well. So in verse number 7 of the conclusion, very quickly, the only time any church contributed out of its treasury to another church was when that church was in want and in order to make them free of want. Now, the reason I think he mentions that is there's a big difference between we have needy saints, but we don't have the money to help them, and we want to have a television program to preach the gospel to the lost, but we can't afford it as we stand right now, so we need money from all you other churches. They made that need. The need was not organic. They made the need. The needs weren't made by the churches. They just fell into it. So 8, 9, and 10 on our conclusion on page 55 ask that question. Well, where's the passage which shows that if a church wants to do more evangelism, they can have a TV program that is funded by other churches? You don't see that anywhere. They can have a TV program because that falls under the generic authority to evangelize. But they can't have the TV program if they need other churches to sponsor it. They've got to do the work. There's no authority for that other kind of pattern. I appreciate your attention. Hopefully that can digest that a little bit, and we'll be on lesson 10, Lord willing,